Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And this is another holiday special because today is the 14th of October, a day you might call Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, depending on your political persuasion. This is a day when we often see news articles and videos praising the foresight and courage of this guy Christopher Columbus, making him out to be a hero, and others describing him as a monster, more or less single-handedly responsible for every evil thing the Native American peoples ever endured. But if you've been listening to me for more than about 5 minutes, you know pretty much no historical figure is all hero or all villain. Every damn one of us, as far as I know, is 100% human, and that means messy. So let's dive in. Who was Christopher Columbus, and is he worth remembering? And if he is, why do I think so? Well, Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, which was not part of Italy at the time because no country called Italy existed yet. His birth date isn't exactly clear, but it was probably sometime in late 1451. Now, Genoa, like most of the other major Italian city-states, was a busy port and an imperial power in its own right, with colonies and allies and enemies all over the Mediterranean and Black Seas. But Columbus's father was not a sailor, but a wool merchant, maybe a weaver, maybe a tavern keeper, or some combination of those. He had 3 brothers and a sister, and whatever his father did, it wouldn't have been enough to secure a future for all 4 of them. So like so many kids before and after him, Columbus went to sea, hiring on to a merchant ship around the age of 10 or so. Well, he must have shown some kind of talent for sailing or navigating or buying and selling, because by 1476 it looks like he had his own ship, or more accurately, his employer trusted him to captain one of his trading vessels. Now, most sea captains in the 1400s would have been sailing around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, some of them venturing out into the Atlantic to sail north up the west coast of Europe or south down the west coast of Africa. Most Genoese captains probably wouldn't have ventured into the North Atlantic or the English Channel or into the North Sea or the Baltic unless there was a really good payday at the end of the journey. Portuguese ships were sailing down the coast of Africa, but they couldn't figure out how to get around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip until 1497. But it was a pretty good time to be a sea captain because the nations of Europe were going apeshit trying to find sea routes to the Far East, specifically to India and China. Why? Well, we mentioned in several episodes that there were already trade routes going all the way across Central Asia that allowed the Bronze Age to become a thing. Those trade routes were still active in the late Middle Ages, and they had expanded to connect the farthest parts of East Africa with Europe. Then the Mongol Empire fell in 1368, which did 2 things. Number 1, it made traveling across Asia much more dangerous because traders now had to pass through territories controlled by a lot of different powers. And 2, it cleared the way for the Ottoman Empire to start expanding, which is exactly what the Ottoman Empire did. In 1453, the Ottomans sacked Constantinople, the first time, incidentally, that cannons were used to reduce a major city, which effectively closed the land route between Europe and the East. So the silks and spices the Europeans had been getting from China and India for hundreds of years were no longer available. So the Age of Discovery, what history books call the period between about 1450 and about 1650, wasn't really about exploring the world, at least not at first. It was about finding a way to sail to India and China. It was about finding a way around the Ottoman Empire. And here comes Columbus, just as it's getting kicked off. Now, as I was growing up, everybody used to say the people of Europe thought the world was flat in 1492, and Columbus was the lone, intrepid adventurer who insisted they were all wrong. It was even a plot point in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, the one where Bugs travels with Columbus and manages to discover America in spite of Columbus's bumbling. I think we've mostly managed to kill that particular myth. But here's a little background for you just in case. Educated people in Europe damn well knew the world was round. In fact, the Greek philosopher Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth in about 240 BCE and managed to get pretty close to the actual size. So by 1492, pretty much everybody who had a reason to care knew the earth was round. But knowing the world is round and being able to navigate from Europe to China are two different questions. See, there's two problems you have to solve, even if there's not a pair of giant continents in the way. The first problem is knowing just how big the earth is. I said Eratosthenes got pretty close to the actual value, but there were other people with other ideas. Most of them got close, but others were a little optimistic. Bottom line is, Columbus went with the optimistic numbers and figured the distance from Spain to Japan was about a quarter of what it actually is. The second problem is knowing where the hell you are. See, it's easy to know where you are on land. You can use landmarks to pinpoint exactly where you are almost anywhere on land. It's also pretty easy to figure out where you are north to south, even on water. If you know how, you can measure the angle of the sun above the horizon during the day, or certain stars at night, and know exactly how far north or south you are. But knowing your position east to west is a different animal, because the earth rotates, so the positions of the sun and stars change as the day rolls along. Yes, compasses have been in use in Europe since about the 12th century, but knowing which direction you're going isn't the same as knowing where you are. That's why ships have pretty much always stayed within sight of land unless they knew exactly where they started and exactly where they were going. Not always. The Norse were one exception, and the Polynesians figured out how to navigate the Pacific thousands of years before there was any such thing as a compass. But the sailors of southern Europe and even the Chinese mostly stuck near the coast. That's why Columbus's idea was such a novel one. To sail out of sight of land for weeks, searching for a place you may or may not have a good location for, was a risky proposition, bordering on crazy. Which is why he had to spend some time searching to find somebody to sponsor his voyage. He went to Portugal first, then Genoa, then Venice. All of them turned him down. He got a big fat no from Spain at first too, but King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I were intrigued enough to put him on retainer until they finished their war to drive the Muslim Moors out of Spain. They called it the Reconquista, the reconquest, except the Moors have been there since the 8th century, so it's probably fair to say it was really just a religious war. But in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella won their religious war and kicked the last of the Moors out. And Columbus was there to ask again. And this time, they said yes. I'm not sure whether they said yes because they really thought he could do it or just to shut this crazy asshole up and get him out of their hair. It makes sense if you think about it. If Columbus could deliver what he promised, Spain stood to make a huge profit. If he couldn't, they were out 3 ships and 1 annoying Genoese sailor. Tough luck for the poor bastards with him on the ships, but you got to do what you got to do. So they named him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, whatever the hell that means, gave him 3 ships, everybody knows their names, and sent him on his way. No shit, there they were. So Columbus set sail on the 3rd of August, 1492, thinking he had to go about 2,400 miles to get to Japan, which would prove he was right about sailing west to get to the Far East. Then he could continue west to China from there. Problem is, it's actually more than 12,000 miles, and there are 2 giant continents in the way. Details, right? Anyway, on the 10th of October, his crews decided they had been out of sight of land just about long enough and tried to mutiny. He managed to get them back under control, and they spotted land 2 days later. Their first landing in what would come to be called the New World was on an island in the Bahamas that the inhabitants called Guanahani. Columbus, being a humble man and an excellent listener, called it San Salvador. The native people called themselves the Arawak, He called them Indios, the word that comes down to us as Indians today, because Columbus was convinced he had found the Far East. Specifically, he figured he had landed on an island off the coast of China. Why he called the natives Indians and not Chinese isn't clear to me, but it's pretty obvious he didn't give two runny shits what they called themselves. They stayed on Guanahani just long enough to replenish their water and provisions, then headed west again. This time they found Cuba, then turned southeast to find Hispaniola, the island where Haiti and the Dominican Republic sit today. He managed to run the Santa Maria on the rocks off Hispaniola after refusing to relinquish the wheel for 2 straight days, so he colonized the island, having his men build a fort he called La Navidad. Then he left 39 men there and set sail again. He made a couple more stops before he finally headed for home. One of them was on the 13th of January, 1493, in northeast Hispaniola. There he ran into the Ciguayos, who gave him the only violent resistance he had on this first voyage. He tried to trade them for some of their bows and arrows. They didn't like his offer, and one Ciguayo ended up stabbed in the butt, and another one got an arrow in his chest. I get the sense he decided not to wait around to see how the situation developed, but I'm going to guess he ended up with more arrows than he really wanted, and he probably wished he could complain to the management about the delivery. I couldn't find any record that mentioned casualties among his crew, so they might have gotten lucky, or he might have forgotten to mention them in his log. So 3 days later, he headed home with the 2 ships he had left, along with souvenirs from the trip like flowers, pearls, a few gold artifacts, tobacco, maybe a turkey, and several Taino he had firmly invited to accompany him. The Spanish rulers were happy to see him again, although I can only imagine they must have been more than a little surprised. Here they probably thought they had gotten rid of this annoying little bastard, and here he pops up again like a bad penny, and it turns out the jackass was right the whole time. At least that's what he claimed, and he had obviously found something. Anybody who had actually traveled to the Far East should have been able to tell Ferdinand and Isabella that the people and the stuff he brought back probably hadn't come from China or India, but in 1493 those folks were pretty thin on the ground. At any rate, they agreed with him that they needed to go back pronto. See, on his way back to Spain, Columbus had gone and told the Portuguese what he had found, and the King of Portugal was already making noises that the trip had been a violation of the Treaty of Alcasovas of 1479, which had divided up the Atlantic and forbidden the Spanish to go poaching Portuguese claims. So the idea that Columbus had found an entirely new landmass still doesn't seem to have occurred to anybody. Because how could a major continent have gone undiscovered for so long, much less 2? But whatever Columbus had found, it immediately became a big fucking deal when the Spanish monarchs learned the Portuguese knew about it. So they sent him back, this time with 17 ships and instructions to spread the gospel among the natives. They left Spain in September 1493, about 6 months after Columbus and his crews had returned. I have no idea whether the poor bastards they had kidnapped were allowed to head back with them. They landed on the island of Dominica on the 3rd of November and started working their way north up the islands to what are now the U.S. Virgin Islands, where they got into a scuffle with several Caribs in a canoe. One Spaniard was mortally wounded and all the Caribs were killed, except one woman who Columbus let one of his officers keep as a slave. Yeah. This is the trip where we really start to see what Columbus thought of the Native Americans. They made it to Puerto Rico on the 17th of November, where it seems like they learned they had accidentally joined a war between the native Taino and the Caribs. The Caribs were apparently raiding the Taino for captives, eating the men and keeping the women as sex slaves. So when they killed the Caribs on St. Croix, they had helped the Taino. Columbus doesn't seem to have done anything with that news. I imagine he didn't much give a fuck, because he continued along the island chain back up to Hispaniola. But when he got back to La Navidad, the settlement where he had left his guys, he found the fort burned and the guys all dead. Apparently they hadn't behaved themselves in his absence, killing people, stealing their stuff, raping their women. So the Taino killed them. Who the hell could have seen that one coming? Now, Columbus doesn't seem to have taken any action against the Taino at the moment, but he established a new settlement on the coast called La Isabela and built a new fort in the interior where he left some guys looking for gold. He sailed on to Cuba, which he decided was a peninsula of China, in April 1494, then Jamaica in May, then back to Hispaniola in August. It looks like that's where he invented the encomienda system, which basically reduced the Taino to the status of slaves whose job was to find gold and cotton for Columbus to send back to Spain. Any native that didn't meet their quota could be killed or mutilated, their ears or noses or hands cut off, or even have dogs set on them. And bear in mind, they were supposed to be bringing these natives to Jesus at the same time, because there's nothing quite so compelling as a God of peace who lets his followers cut your dad's ears off because he couldn't find enough gold. Well, you can imagine how well this stupid-ass fucking system worked. Not only was it ridiculously brutal, turns out there just wasn't enough gold on the island for the Taino to meet their quotas, and no amount of mutilation or killing or dogs was going to make there be more. And 1494 was bad for both sides in another way, because that's when tropical diseases started ravaging the Spanish settlers and European diseases started ravaging the Native Americans. Maybe 2/3 of the Spanish settlers died, and between the diseases and Spanish management practices, maybe 50,000 Taino died between 1492 and 1495. It got so bad that one of Columbus's governors, a man named Margarit, and a priest named Fray Buil, sailed back to Spain in late 1494 to complain about Columbus's conduct toward both the natives and the Spanish. Nothing seems to have come of that complaint, but stay tuned. It won't be the last one. Then, in March 1496, Columbus left 2 of his brothers in charge on Hispaniola and headed back to Spain. And in May 1498, he headed back again. This time he was determined to find Asia. He took a more southerly course that took him eventually to Venezuela, where he discovered the Orinoco River, traded for pearls and a little bit of gold, then headed north to Hispaniola again. He arrived in August to find the Spanish settlers in revolt because the riches he had promised them had been, let's say, a little oversold. Like so many future colonists to the New World and other places, they had signed on expecting to become Scrooge McDuck, and instead had found themselves in pretty much the same condition they had left Europe in, only this time they were half a world from home with the addition of endemic tropical diseases and the occasional hostile natives to deal with. Because it turns out colonization of a new place is pretty much like most other human endeavors. A few people get lucky, or find themselves in the right place at the right time with the right skills, or find they're the only ones willing to make the hard calls. A few die, and the rest get what they can, which may be more than they had before, but maybe isn't enough to change their lives. But back to Columbus. He had some of the ringleaders hanged and managed to regain control at least until a new governor arrived from Spain, Francisco de Bobadilla. He heard both sides' complaints, then had Columbus and one of his brothers put in chains and sent back to Spain in October 1500. And to add insult to injury, Vasco da Gama had returned to Portugal in 1499, having sailed to India around the southern tip of Africa. Where Columbus was still spazzing around trying to find his sea route to the Far East, da Gama had found another one. Columbus may or may not have heard about the voyage from Hispaniola, but Ferdinand and Isabella certainly knew about it, and he would have learned of it at the latest when he arrived in Spain for his trial. Well, the king and queen brought him before them and heard his tearful confession and let him go. They let him have another fleet and sent him back for one more voyage, but he wasn't going to be governor anymore. And by now, I imagine that was just fine with him. So, in March 1502, he headed back. This time, he avoided Hispaniola, instead landing at Cuba and Jamaica before heading west, and ultimately sailing down the coast of modern-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. There he may have met some Maya, who introduced him to cacao, the beans that give us chocolate. Other natives told him of a land called Siware, 9 days to the west, where he thought he could find plenty of gold as well as pepper from India. By this time, Columbus was in no condition to chase the story 9 days across Central America. But he recorded the story and eventually sent it back, along with a note that Siware was 10 days from the Ganges River, which today forms the boundary between India and Pakistan. Now, I'm not entirely sure how the hell he could have gotten that from conversations with people he didn't have a common language with, and who would have had no idea where the Ganges River was. I'm going to guess he heard what he wanted to hear there. So, they left Panama in April 1503, got caught up in a storm off the Caymans, and ended up shipwrecked in Jamaica in June. The natives told him to go fuck himself and mostly refused to help, but it looks like they left him alone for a while. One of his guys managed to talk a few of them into taking a canoe with him to Hispaniola, where the governor also said Columbus could go fuck himself. When the natives started getting tired of having him around and started threatening violence, he used his navigation skills to predict a lunar eclipse on the 29th of February 1504, impressing the locals enough that they left him alone. And finally, the guy he had sent to Hispaniola came through, somehow managing to get a ship to Jamaica to pick up Columbus and the other survivors and bring them back to Hispaniola. He stayed until September, then booked passage on a ship heading back to Spain. By the time he got back in November, Columbus didn't have much left. He settled in Seville in April 1505, spent a year arguing with the Spanish crown over whether and how much money they owed him and his heirs, and died in May 1506. A hell of a life, if nothing else. So we don't have any battle to look at for this one, so no scorecard like we usually try to do. Instead, we're going to take a couple of minutes to talk about how to think about this dude, Chris Columbus. So what do we make of this guy? To me, the best we can say of Columbus is that he was a man of exceptional courage. He had to be packing a pair of iron cannonballs in his drawers just to try that voyage for the first time, and a talented and lucky navigator. It looks like he was a fair ship's captain just based on the number of mutinies he faced. There were at least 2 or 3, and I only mentioned one of them here, and managed to put down without violence. And he was a piss-poor governor, both to the Spaniards and to the Taino. So, monster or hero? Well, it's popular these days to say Columbus didn't discover anything. After all, there were already people everywhere he went. Fair enough. And he went to his grave apparently unaware, maybe stubbornly unaware, that he had never found Asia. It wasn't until the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci suggested maybe the Americas were an undiscovered continent that we started to realize there was a whole new world out there. But that was in 1503, so Columbus had at least a couple of years to kick the concept around. A few of his letters suggest he may have considered the idea, but I couldn't find a clear statement saying he knew he had found a new world. And we call them the Americas these days, not the Columbias. So there's that. He wasn't even the first European to have set foot in the Americas. The Norse explorer Leif Erikson set up a settlement in what he called Vinland, modern Newfoundland, in 1003 that lasted a couple of years before being abandoned. But I couldn't find any evidence that Columbus knew of that settlement, or that he could have known, or that any European would have connected Vinland with Columbus's discoveries in the Caribbean if they had known. And after all, Columbus never got any farther in North America than Honduras, and no farther than Venezuela in South America. He never had any idea the size of the landmasses he supposedly discovered. But the bottom line is this. Nobody in Europe had any idea the Americas were there before Columbus went and looked. In that sense, it's fair to say he discovered the Americas, even if he had no idea what he had found, even though there were already people there. And his conduct as governor was at best incompetent, at worst despotic. Personally, I lean toward incompetent. I think this guy had no idea how to run a colony, especially one made up of people who didn't speak his language or share his culture, and he would much rather have been out there sailing, hunting for Asia. The fact that he couldn't control his own Spanish subjects and had to start hanging them, the fact that he saw no value in the Taino except what they could extract for him or their value as slaves sold back to Europe, the fact that he had to keep upping the ante with more and more draconian punishments. This sounds to me like a guy who just felt like people ought to obey him and couldn't figure out why they wouldn't. Now that's not to minimize or forgive his conduct. A lot of people died because of Columbus's shitty leadership. Would the so-called conquest of the New World have been different if somebody else had made first contact? Maybe, but I doubt it. Europeans of the day were not a tolerant bunch, and they had no context to understand another culture except in terms of which was superior and which was inferior. And at least since the Roman Empire, those terms have been defined as which side came out on top in a fight. I think conquest and subjugation were probably inevitable, no matter who made first contact. And somebody was gonna. We remember Columbus because he had a crazy idea and got lucky. But if it hadn't been him, somebody would have tried it in 1495, or 1500, or 1515. It's a little silly to imagine the Americas would have remained isolated if Columbus hadn't sailed west. It's also not fair to blame Columbus for the diseases that ravaged the Native Americans, or for the conduct of the explorers and colonizers and conquerors who followed him. Yes, he and his crews were the initial vectors for the diseases, but in an age before germ theory or any scientific concept of how diseases infect people, not to mention no way of knowing how vulnerable the Native Americans would be, it's hard to see what they might have done differently. And we've already established that he set a pretty lousy example of how to treat the Native Americans. But it's hard to see who might have done better, or whether a better example would have inspired any of the later explorers to behave better. If we're going to demonize him for his conduct, we can't also demonize him for the conduct of those he had no authority or control over. So yeah, definitely not a hero, even though he possessed some admirable qualities. And maybe not quite the monster we've made him out to be since the 90s, even though he did some terrible things. Just like we said at the beginning, Columbus was 100% human, with all the mess and confusion and contradiction that comes with that. A lot like you and me. If you enjoyed this holiday special episode, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. If you have the day off today, I hope you've enjoyed your long weekend, including this video. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. Until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.